For this panel discussion, I would like to introduce Emily Fripp. Emily is the founder and director at Ethica, and also on our board of trustees. She has more than 20 years of experience in the field of natural resource economics, specialising in sustainable use and trade of natural resources and agricultural commodities. Emily also, which is great for us, has plenty of experience hosting these panels, so we're very thankful for her, to her for offering to do this. Most recently, she was involved in the multi-stakeholder side of the Forest, Agricultural Commodities and Trade group at COP26, and you'll continue to be involved in that when COP27 comes round again. So thank you very much, Emily, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Luke, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be here and for one of the concluding sessions of today, but I also think one of the most important, but then I'm probably biased. I think just wanted to reflect that, yes, I'm a trustee. I've been around as a trustee for 8 or 9 years, and I think there's myself, there's Charlie in the room, Mark, we've all been here for a fair while, and we're growing as a trustee, as a foundation, but I wanted you all to sort of realise there's a few of us that are a bit grey behind the scenes. And then the technical advisory committee, Peter and co, who I think you all know, but we've been here for many a year and we continue to provide behind the scenes support to the team as we grow and evolve. So that sort of little note of who we are, and there's some grey matter behind the young faces and the expanding team that we've got. Talking of young faces, hello. Look at this sprightly panel we've got with us. We're growing as an organisation. It's been quite phenomenal, and the numbers that were up on the screen this morning by Keith really showcased the scale and the speed that we're growing at. That also causes a lot of risk. And we're managing the risk, but I think today is a chance to sort of think, how do we continue this? Your scary statistic you put up this morning, Keith, of sort of growing by tenfold, was it? A tenfold increase in the next 5 years. Well, okay, that's going to be a good one. But I think what we'd like to explore today is how do we do that whilst maintaining our values? How do we do it whilst we grow and learn from the previous panel where we heard about the sort of importance of that community model, working with local governments, empowering people on the ground, because that's where the scale really can come, whilst at the same time engaging with local governments, regional governments, national, international governments. How do we capitalise on all of this? There's a huge excitement around the world of carbon markets, I would say now, is the most I've known in the last 10 years, and it's a great opportunity, but we need to grab it with both hands, but we also need to sort of make sure we do it in the right way. So, great panel that we've got here today. Keith, I think some of you might have met already. And we're coming up, Mark is the sort of part of Taking Root, so community, over here. I'm going my list, and they were supposed to sit in the same order. And another Mark for Carbon Tanzania, so lots of wealth and experience there. Tim Whitley, who's COTAP, who's involved in buying and reselling and working, and then great to have Molly Hawes from Spring Nature, so also a reseller in the process. So we're going to sort of kick off with a little bit of an exploration about their thoughts and how we've got to where we've got to start. So I'd like to start with Khalil. Khalil, Taking Root Community, where you're at. You're the founder of Community, and it's an industry leader in developing smallholder restoration projects. Taking Root provides technology and support that's made it simple for organisations on the ground to create the certificates and the finance. And I think that's a bit of a flagship tool. Community project in Nicaragua sort of has been doing this scaling with care approach. It's one of the largest restoration initiatives in the country, and it's been working with a handful of farmers to become a nationwide program, restoring over 10,000 hectares of land. So it's one of Plan Vivo's largest projects. So Khalil, you know all about scaling with care. How have you managed that process, and what are the sort of challenges that you've had to overcome, and how in getting that scale that you have?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you everyone for having me. It's a real honor to be able to share with you. I remember not that many years ago, or 10, 15 years ago, coming to my first one and feeling like very much the new kid on the block. Over the years, we've learned a lot about how to work with smallholder farmers and grow trees at increasing scales. And we always thought we were, made it big, and then we set our ambitions higher. I want to preface by saying that while we have a pretty great trajectory of scaling with care, we are very much learners and are trying to figure out how to keep getting to the next level. We operate with small landholders, generally just a couple of hectares, but there's nothing small about the projects that we develop. In fact, we did have over 6,000 hectares this year and are working towards 20,000 hectares per year in the next couple of years, so scaling with care is very much at the heart of what we're focusing on. The way that we think about it is as follows. Growing trees with farmers is inherently a human process, right? We're essentially trying to change practices, so we're moving away from business as usual, and that's a human process. And that is at the core of the care piece. We're working, it's human interactions, and we want to keep those very much to be high quality, and we want to do a lot more of them. And so how do you scale something that's so inherently human, right? How do you do that? How do you keep that care and scale? And so we've divided our work basically into 3 pillars and think about the scaling strategy quite differently for these 3 pillars, and looking at the role where systems and technology can play a role and not play a role. And so if we start very much at the farmer level, it has been our experience, and I think this will not be surprising to everyone, that where that human relationship and the trust that's built between the project and the farmers who are participating is critical and core to the whole thing. And that is not to be replaced in any way by technological tools. That is the core of what makes this work. It's a human process. Now that doesn't mean there's not efficiencies that can be had along the way, which takes us to our level 2 areas. And these are areas where we still believe humans are the core piece to the whole thing, but they can be enhanced by the use of certain tools and processes. So for example, with management, and so trees need to be grown and need to be cared for. There's a lot of training that needs to happen, and that training is also best done on a human-to-human level. However, knowing where to go, when, by who, at what time, can be greatly enhanced by certain tools that say, hey, it's been a long time since this farmer's been visited. It's the rainy season. This is probably time where this activity needs to take place. And so the humans still are aided by these technological tools to know where to go when, and then engage in that human relationship. And then the third category are the types of things where, in many ways, they're tasks that are really important to be done well, and humans aren't necessarily the best at it always, and usually don't like it because they're super repetitive. So for example, carbon quantification, right? And we do this forest inventory, and you want to calculate how much carbon's there. That's a copious amount of calculations of numbers that, aside from a few nerds like myself, and actually probably a few people here too, quite enjoy. It's kind of like voodoo black magic for a lot of people. Yet we really want the integrity, transparency for it to place. And their computers do a wonderful job at that, right? We can create the processes to be completely transparent. They can be done really effectively. And so we can still create like really high quality, transparent, rigorous carbon calculations, which humans don't have to do. Like the computers and the machines can do that quite well. And so like by combining these 3 approaches and knowing which to apply when, is how we view and how we've gone about this sort of scaling with care.
Brilliant, thank you. And how do you manage the sort of bit where you get more and more finance and we're getting all this disclosure and reporting needed and there's more interest? There is a sort of need for greater reporting, greater data, and that's pretty onerous, or can be incredibly onerous on communities. How do you sort of work with that? Is that where the sort of technology solutions have a role to play in that sort of monitoring, reporting, getting that balance right, I guess?
Yeah, so obviously like reporting, like we are a big proponent of transparency. What we need to do in this industry is build trust. If people don't trust what's ultimately being done, if people think it's a scam, then this isn't going to work. And so we need to build that trust. So obviously things like carbon reporting is one way of doing it, but there's so much more reporting that can take place and build that trust. I also want to say, I think as project developers, we also have to push back to some extent, because not everything should be transparent. And that's been a learning lesson for us along the way. So some indicators are really, really valuable for like marketing purposes, but shouldn't necessarily be shared. And I think, you know, increasingly people are aware of like data privacy issues. And so I just think that's an area that, that requires careful consideration.
Brilliant, thank you. And you might have noticed that we're also missing one of our panelists today, if we've got the photo. So Manarusi unfortunately wasn't able to join us due to visas, but we've got a short video we're going to show at the end of today. So if you're looking at the panel and looking at the screen and going, it doesn't quite add up, it will do later. So I want to come to Mark as Carbon Tanzania, Yeda Valley Project. Mark, you're raised in Tanzania, you're a biologist, it's been your sort of bread and butter, sort of, you know, growing up somewhere, watching this develop and learn. Co-founder of Carbon Tanzania, designing and developing projects. But you sort of validated your first RED project with Plan Vivo in 2012. So RED, that's always been quite a challenge when I work and talk at the government level. So great that that got going in so early. That's one of the early RED programs back in 2012. And from that, a project of 220 kilometre squares, you're growing. I mean, now over 30,000 kilometre square kind of in terms of project. I mean, that's vast. You obviously know all about scaling. So in your experience then, sort of, how have you sort of managed that process over the last 10 years of scaling to such a level? How important is the Plan Vivo way of working that sort of core values to that process, and how have you brought it all together?
Well, I think just to emphasize, this is a human project. This is a human process, and that's absolutely critical. And I think you've seen that in the previous panels with people. You're talking about livelihoods, you're talking about rights, you're talking about land, you're talking about resources. I mean, these are all critical parts, and I think the big question is, how do you grow that? And when we started in Yeda Valley, we were lucky enough to partner with an organization that helped us do the land use planning. And in Tanzania, land use and natural resource planning and law allows decentralization, and that is a critical part of creating this symbolic representation, which is what a carbon credit essentially is. But it has to be anchored in law. And as we've grown, we started our first, you know, don't boo and hiss, but most of our projects are actually VRR, VCS, VM7, and CCD. And as we've gone to scale and now at 30,000 square kilometers, we are working on the jurisdictional process in terms of carbon accounting. We are working with the national government in terms of regulations, and those regulations will be out in the next month or so. So we've taken all this government engagement work on board early and really led the way in Tanzania to bring all this to scale. And of course, all these regulations will enable other carbon project developers to be able to come into the country and fit into the system. And I think that's critical because it helps the government then understand what this messy carbon world is. And I think we've heard that earlier, that a lot of concern from people within government, and I think rightfully so, and a lot of confusion that is created by donor partners, bilateral governments, partly UNFCCC, needs to be sort of, you need as the voluntary carbon market then to try and sort of work on that and work on developing this scale. And then there's the finance, and we're transferring millions of dollars a year to communities, and that's where the government's really focused, obviously. So we have to talk about tax codes. We have to talk about it in the context of should there be a royalty. So scaling is not just carbon, it's not just people, it's not just projects, it's the legal framework. And that's where we've really focused with the Tanzanian government to be able to work on all of those elements, and there is a cost to that. And I think the reality as we go to scale, one of the reality for people entering this market, one of the reality for people who want to grow, is that the investors, the money needs to understand that the legal cost and the legal process and the asset generation is part of the context of scale. And I'd just like to finish by saying one of the things we've done which is unique amongst other VRR projects, and I think it's the reason we've won several awards, is because we started off with Plan Vivo, and we've taken those core principles into the VRR space, and that's unique. VRR does not work like this, as many of you, I'm sure, I'm sure know. And so there is a role here for Plan Vivo as a standard to stand up to the world and say success exists at scale, and it exists because of these core principles. And I think that's a really, really important thing for Plan Vivo to just carry on emphasising.
Fantastic, thank you. And I think that sort of balancing the growing interest of government as well as finance. I mean, it's now sort of like, okay, London's going to become a hub of carbon trading. We're going to do this. We've got NDCs. We've got carbon and climate commitments. It's almost like that's a project in itself, handling that. I mean, as a small organisation, how do you find the time to sort of do that bit of the challenge? I'm sure that not every project that we work with would have the capacity to engage in that way, or the skill set.
Grow. You simply have to build the capacity to deal with the communications thread, which is critical, to deal with the legal thread, to deal with the data management thread, the government engagement thread. That all has to be dealt with. And there are lots of people in the world in consultancy who are happy to come and work with projects on some of these legal details. So we've also brought people in from different parts of the world and, you know, sit down, here we go, you're a lawyer, sit down for 3 months, carbon credit, what is it? Define it. Because that's critical if you want a tax code.
And I really interesting, got the brain whirring there about sort of, maybe there's people in the room, buyers and donors, but sort of organisations, that it doesn't have to be a consultancy fee, does it? There's lots of projects where people want to, their own staff nowadays want to go and experience on the ground and get involved. So maybe there's some pro bono stuff we should be exploring. Anyway, I want to move on. Tim at COTAP, a reseller, the carbon offsets to alleviate poverty was set up by Tim in 2011. It's a US-based charity, and it only supports Plan Vivo projects. And unlike a traditional reseller model, COTAP sells before it buys by crowdsourcing the offset donations primarily from individuals and small organisations. And I love this sort of, you work with all sorts of people, from sort of crypto projects, tech billionaires, and Ziggy Marley. I was very excited about that sort of space. You know, the last 10, 11 years, lots have changed. There's been some great interest in carbon, huge plummets in carbon, not interest. We're now in a buoyancy sort of frame of mind. So from your side, what has kept you going throughout this last 10 years? How do you keep that momentum going? And where do you see, you know, the challenges to overcome to still be here with us today? Thank you. And where do we go next?
COTAP. That was a pretty good introduction. Yeah, it kind of encapsulates things. You know, yeah, scale is always been a kind of a vexing, elusive thing for us, but it's like the contours of the opportunity are there. And I believe in the potential for scale as much as I did back when I launched COTAP in 2011. Just by, you know, with a small idea, obtain an agreement with projects to obtain the right but not the obligation to buy, but also importantly on the demand side in the terms of use to let folks know that in the case that we can't place those tons, we reserve the right to find other projects. And so the flexibility, like the way it was set up, like the framework, with you know, COTAP not, you know, usually crowdfunding offset donations mostly in small modest amounts, and then giving them to projects. It's been effective so far, but it also, you know, if you don't hold inventory and money could come in from wherever at, you know, whatever amount, whenever. And I've always been trying to, well, in the early days, I was trying to pursue like a high visibility event where, you know, COTAP is designed as a consumer-facing brand. The idea is to, you know, say what you do and why you do it, which is kind of rare in the provider and reseller space. Like, who wants to say carbon offsets these days? They'll say anything else, but it's basically the same thing. And, you know, it all packs up into an acronym that deliberately lends itself well to unaided recall for the purposes of consumer marketing. COTAP? It's like, or is it, you know, I'm not going to make up some, you know, natural impacts, sorry, nature, you know, and so, and if that were to happen, I could potentially, you know, COTAP could potentially be sitting on a lot of money, which is not directable to projects if they're sold out, and that could be a bit of a mess. And I've like, when I set it up, I've basically been trying to create that mess, because it's a good one, you know. What if somebody's, and I think just to take a step back and pause, it's a great thing to see, even though COTAP has not been a direct part of a lot of the success of the projects. There were 7 of them when I started it. It's great to see that there are, you know, challenges for me that are, you know, and as a result of the projects doing really well, you know, in terms of selling their stuff. And so, but yeah, some of the, you know, when you say what you're about and, you know, you're out there on the internet and you kind of, the market kind of tells you what you are, and they impute stuff that you aren't, you know, on you, or they'll think things about, you know, about you that are, you know, they'll think things about you that are untrue, or they won't think things about you that you're trying to emphasize. You know, they won't believe it or go for it or bite. And so, yeah, you know, it's been, and then occasionally, you know, things will happen like an individual happens to offset their personal emissions, but they also happen to be on the sustainability team at a large corporation. And you get a conversation going about, you know, making sure that Plan Vivo is included as an acceptable standard in the RFP design process. But, you know, it all stemmed from the happenstance of that person offsetting as an individual. And it turned out COTAP has not really worked well in the corporate context, but which is not to say it can't, but it's just not the focus, because it hasn't provided because of COTAP's like design. It's like you really, by the time an RFP comes out, the big players were there 2 years earlier, given, you know, webinars and policy briefs, and, you know, they basically write the RFP. And so, and it took getting kicked in the face a couple of times to kind of realize that, you know. And it's just, but, you know, it's broadly relevant, and the untapped opportunity for in terms of sorry, that's too close. Individuals is still, it's as big as it ever was. You know, I read something recently where 1% of people offset their air travel through the programs offered by the airlines. It would have been more useful to, you know, to also know how many people do it outside. But you know, back when I started it, you know, there's no reason why you can't get at least 250,000 people in the U.S. because it was based on Kiva, which was a micro lending website which took off and addressed the unbanked and fragmented rural settings as a market failure, because there wasn't too much business in one place for banks to go after as customers. So, and so yeah, there have been some close calls, and like kind of, you know, it's like too small a scale. Maybe it should just. But then like those stories, like, you know, 2013, like, you know, Ziggy Marley came along, and then like, you know, I had it like a low point, you know, a few years after that, and then. Khalil's kicked me under the table in meetings before when I was talking too much. But then you get story, like you get a donation, and then somebody follows that up like a few months later. And it's like, you know, that wasn't actually from me. That was my daughter, who's 9 years old, who was saving up her allowance and chores money to offset their COTAP. And it's just, you know, it's got traction and relevance, you know. But, you know, coming back to like the future opportunity for offsetting from individuals, you know, I'm just now starting to kind of, COTAP's getting its legs under it and being organized and budgeted to where it can like pay somebody to do proper search engine optimization, because 8,000 people search about carbon emissions a day in the US, and they're probably mostly students. doesn't show up on the first page of the results, and that's like, it's a huge, like, in terms of where we could be, and it's like, I've been distracted by many things, but like, just fixing that one thing alone could change the game, you know, and I think that opportunity is still there. It still excites me. 10 years on, I still get, you know, it's 10 years on, so.
We'll call it there for now. But
kick from Khalil.
It's fascinating, and yeah, before there's a sort of punch up in the check shirt gang. I think we'll hand over to Molly. I mean, it's a great segue of sort of the importance. You can really see the value here that we're talking about, the core essence of a Plan Vivo credit. It means a lot to everybody on the panel, but in this room as well. I think, you know, we're not talking offsetting. We get labelled with offsetting. We are an offset, but we're more than that. And I think that capitalises all of it. And Molly, this is important for your organisation, for Springer Nature as well. And, you know, you're the Senior Climate Action and Engagement Manager.
Not very catchy, sorry.
It's kind of long, but we won't try and do an acronym on that one. But your role was created and evolved because it recognised the importance of this sort of measuring and your carbon and nature within the work you're doing and as an organisation. I mean, Springer Nature Group is a leading publisher of sustainability research and publishes journals such as Nature and Nature Climate Change, etc. And you know, before that you've always been involved in and interested in this arena, but I think it's kind of inherent that Plan Vivo means a lot, that, you know, that you've been involved and Springer Nature's been involved in that. So from your side, I mean, your bio-credits, in particular the Cussey Hills and the community work, why was Plan Vivo such an important sort of mechanism for Springer Nature? And, you know, as the demand has grown, you know, there's lots of challenges. I mean, are you being encouraged to look elsewhere, or is sort of Plan Vivo still at the heart of where you'd like to sort of focus?
Yeah, so to the first part, why Plan Vivo? So because we publish things like Nature, Climate Change and Nature, what that means for me is that I have the chief editor of Nature Climate Change coming and looking at all my plans and saying, does this follow best practice? Are we following all this amazing science that we're publishing? So for us, we're really trying to define what best practice is in a sector where best practice isn't necessarily clear, I think, to a lot of corporates. And when we put together an advisory panel of key editors from some of our most relevant journals, and what they were saying to us, even before SBTI started talking about co-benefits, they were saying to us, you know, we have to have projects which have participatory research at their core, which go out to local communities, which have sort of biodiversity and water impacts. And that's just something that we weren't seeing, I think, in a lot of the projects that we were looking at the beginning. And Plan Vivo sort of stood out to us as a system that we could use to assess carbon credits for choosing something that's, you know, I think truly holistic. And as someone who has a geology background as well, I'm always thinking about carbon storage in terms of longevity. You know, I've thought in terms of millions of years in the past. I try and scale that back to hundreds or thousands of years for these kinds of conversations. But as was spoken about in the panel earlier, if we're not engaging local people, and that's what Plan Vivo really speaks to, if we're not doing that, then these forestry offsets are not going to be storing carbon over a meaningful timescale. So that was, you know, sort of why Plan Vivo for us. And the second part of your question, could you remind me?
Sort of, there'll be challenges and issues and risks with this as you grow, and how, as an organisation, are you sort of thinking about those?
Yeah, we're definitely, so in terms of scaling up our offsetting, we currently offset scope 1 and 2 and partial scope 3. Obviously the main focus for us then has to be massive emissions reduction rather than offsetting everything else. But something that we are looking into is, you know, while we scale up the amount that we need to offset, we might also want to think about diversifying that portfolio. So we currently work with 2 fantastic projects through sea level, so that's Community Taking Root and the Cussey Hills project. And we're, you know, as well as potentially scaling those up, we're also starting to think about some of the other projects that Darren's introduced us to, for example. We're thinking about blue carbon, we're thinking about mangroves. We're also thinking about direct air capture, and there's this question for us about what's best practice in terms of driving the carbon market. We need to make sure we've got some really solid ongoing projects that we know we're investing in so that we're balancing the books in a kind of the mathematical way. But we're also now, the next stage for us will be thinking about how we're investing to take nascent projects forwards and to help build the market.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to ask Keith a question and then we're going to come to the floor. So get your questions ready and then I will allow the panellists to have a final reflection on sort of moving forward and opportunities to wrap things up. But Keith, so CEO of Plan Vivo, you've been with us since June 2020, is that all? But a real rural community development background in Africa, working across Africa, and that sort of development. You've got the experience of sort of developing and growing an organisation as well as hands-on on the ground with the conservation and community work. You've been quite busy in the last 2 years, but there's some great experience we've learned from the panel, from the discussion so far today. What do you see as have been the main challenges that we've got to face as an organisation? We have been facing, we've still got to face, whilst we try and capture this sort of forward-looking momentum of sort of opportunity.
Thanks, Emily. The good thing with going last is everybody's already answered the question, so I can just steal off them, so that's good. But I think, to answer your question, I want to start by kind of some of the things we have. And I want to pick on a point that Pauline said on the last panel. I think people have a perception that the Plan Vivo model is very good, that it has that care, that scaling with the care bit is what we're all about, right? It's about the people. It's about the holistic approach. It's about the benefit sharing. That's the bit. That's what we're about. If we don't scale with the care, then we're not Plan Vivo. But because of that care, people, I think, have a perception that we're niche and fluffy and we can't be scaled. And fair enough, maybe 25 years ago, there was some merit in that. But 25 years later, we have projects that have scaled. They haven't changed the model. They haven't had to strip out all the community benefits to do it. So I think what we have is now an evidence base and models. We have, if I can call them lighthouse type models or projects that have already figured out how to do this at scale and keep the care. So I think the challenge for us is to change people's perception that this model with the co-benefits, or I'm going to steal another bit from Zoe, she calls them core benefits, because for, I think, our projects, they are core benefits. Of course, it's carbon credits, but the social impact, the biodiversity impact are just as important. So really it's about perception. How do we, I think somebody said it in the last panel as well, can we become better as a network at talking about the Plan Vivo model, not just as a standard, not just at a project level, but as a whole approach that can deliver, all these pledges, $1 trillion a year for nature-based solutions. All the models that they've tried before don't work. It doesn't. The trickle-down approach, I think we can all agree, doesn't work. It's not going to work for the UK, and it's not going to work in development. So we need a model that makes sure that money reaches the people on the ground who need it to do the job. So yeah, we're anti-trickle down. That's our new branding.
We are north of the border, aren't we? Opening up the floor, it is the real opportunity now to quiz these fine folk on the panel here and make the most of questions from today. And you've got Keith, so only questions in general, really. But
can we do Molly's approach of gentle questioning, though?
No,
I like that idea.
No. Well, for Molly, yes, but the rest, the four in the middle, go for it. And please just remind us who you are when you stand up, just so everyone knows.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roland from IOD Park, and I'm just wondering, when you speak to the projects, what are the main requests you get from them in terms of supporting their journey to scale up?
I'm going to ask the projects.
I don't think we've ever asked any of the standards we work with how we scale up. We just scale up. I think it's really important to, realise that there isn't another room somewhere of people tackling nature-based climate solutions. Currently, this is the room. And there's a weight of responsibility there. If we build these projects, we should be proud of them. We should tell the world about them. We should be applying awards for them. Last week we won a Global Finance Award, and 2 years ago we won the Equator Prize within our project base. We should be telling these stories. It's really powerful. There are no barriers to scale other than the regulatory frameworks that are in existence, such as UNFCCC. They don't really like the voluntary carbon market. We have to look at that and work towards it and understand those regulations so we can build into it. We must work with our national governments to ensure that we're in line with other government policies around development and human rights and all of that sort of process. So, have I ever asked you how we scale up? I don't think so. I think we just said, let's scale up.
Khalil?
I'm not 100% sure I understand the question, but if the question is, what do we want from the standard to scale? And now I get to ask under the pressure of the room. I mean, I guess two parts to it. I mean, the first one, Mark, absolutely agree. We do not ask the standard. It's more get out of our way so that we can do this. Where it does come in, and we have conversations about it, is this. I think the standard in itself was built at a time where these projects were a lot smaller, and as we scale, our needs for clarification become much more specific. We are trying to standardize and grow at scale, and we want to standardize so that we make sure we keep the care part as we scale. That forcibly requires that we work with as little ambiguity as possible into what the rules are, because ultimately we want to keep our own ethics and we want to keep compliance. And we start doing this at larger scale, we find that many times the standards are quite unspecific, and that non-specificity is in the name of flexibility, but we want to operate quick and fast and big. We really need that clarity. This is not a criticism by any means. The Plan Vivo standard is an amazing group of people, which we're very much aligned, and we work very collaboratively in helping to build that shared clarity.
Can I ask a sort of follow-up question, and please jump in, and I'm also looking towards Pauline, who I hope is going to kind of come in with some questions, but how do you keep that sort of access to information flowing and the requirements, this sort of changing market, changing policy, changing regulation? That accident, it's hard enough to keep up to date with what's going on and abreast of all the things you have to do and you have to meet when you're actually kind of in the UK sitting next to a buyer, let alone like if I was in the middle of in a community project in the middle of Indonesia. I mean, how do you do that? How do you make sure communities really get to see what the opportunity is and manage those two very diverse worlds?
You mind if I start? I have strong opinions on this one. First and foremost, as Mark said, there isn't another room. I know that at least in the context of Nicaragua, we are the most knowledgeable people in the world at doing what we do. And so we do not look for other people outside to tell us how to do it, what's right. We take our own views based on our experience and the conversations we have where we operate and what is the right way to do things. And then we, in a polite way, tell the outside world, bend your things to make it work for this, because this is real. And most of the time, it much goes well beyond standards, but like market expectations are based on a whole bunch of external factors, which are, quite frankly, often completely off base from reality. But I know the intentions are wrong. And so we have an important role in educating the marketplace on what's right. And it took me a while, personally, to build that confidence. But having done this for so many years and have watched the industry say that everything that we do was horrible, and then change their minds and say, this is the right way to do it, sort of has allowed that. And to give some specific examples, when we started this, there was a lot of, like in 2000, and even prior, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of resistance to the idea that nature should play any role in this whatsoever, and you were basically a scam artist that you thought nature should play a role in fighting climate change. This is not a joke. This was reality now. And now everyone's like, nature-based solutions! But get the pesky humans out of the way. They're the problem. Make sure there are no humans in these projects. And then they're like, what you're doing is just wrong, to now like, oh, co-benefits. Turns out that's important. So how many times is it like they have to completely change their minds to realize, no, wait, maybe we can take our first-hand experience and be confident that, you know, we're doing a few things right.
Build great partnerships and tell great stories, I think, are both really, really important. There are good people out there who you can work with. We partner with lots of big conservation NGOs where we work, and we now have the confidence to tell them what they should be saying and tell them what they need to say. And I think that's really, really important. But we also, in terms of the buyers that we work with them on long-term deals, long-term agreements, stabilize the finance, and tell powerful stories. And I think that's really, really critical. You're absolutely right that there is still a world out there of people who think about communities and they talk about community-based conservation. This is community-led conservation. This is building from the bottom, and this is projects reflecting on how land use types exist, how they're used, and how they've been used for thousands of years. You cannot imagine how many people have asked me how I train the Maasai to protect their landscape. You must be joking. They've been doing it for thousands of years. You don't need to. That's a silly thing to focus on. Environmental education. Really? No, come on. People know how valuable their environment is. We're just fitting a valuable piece of this jigsaw puzzle. And that's also out there in academia, out there in the buyers, built into the standards. So great partnerships, communicating, I think, are really important.
Okay. Well, Tim,
just quickly, just add a quick point. I kind of think a bit like my fashion sense, or my fashion strategy, which is to stay in the same mode and wait for it to come back into fashion. I feel a bit like that's happened with Plan Vivo, because what the guys are describing here is what we've believed when we started 25 years ago was the only way to do these projects, right? Now, the carbon market has evolved to a point where everybody comes in and criticises bad practice in the carbon market, and some of it is bad and it should be criticised. But people are now looking and saying, well, how could we stop this bad practice? And they're realising community-led transparency, benefit sharing, we already had the solution. It's just we're coming back, so we're coming back to fashion. Now, the difference is, can we make it stick a little bit more? Can we now try and hold the rest of these markets, of this potential to account? And I think bringing in, we picked a panel here to try and show the different parts of the carbon value chain, right? The projects, the communities, the resellers, the buyers. Bringing in new people into our network, new people who are saying, actually, we're really choosing to buy Plan Vivo, or really choosing to develop a project in the Plan Vivo model, can give us a lot more credibility about changing that perception, and then trying to hold the rest of the market to account and saying, why aren't you doing the same thing? Because if you're not, as Pauline said, the risk is bigger. You're not engaging with these communities. It's not more risky to engage communities. It's more risky not to engage them.
Brilliant. Go for it. One there, and then we'll come here. Or there's two on that. We'll go.
Céline Yvon from the Traffic Graph Foundation. Thank you, everyone. It's really brilliant. It's very interesting for me to attend. We talked a lot about scaling up, right? How the Plan Vivo can actually increase its footprint through bigger projects, more projects, etc. And building on the last two remarks, I'd like to focus a little bit on scaling across. How to make sure that whatever you have, mentioned right now about, influencing others becomes maybe as part of the core work that some of you might be doing in the future, because that's how scale is going to be obtained at some point. Scaling up, but also scaling across. So I'm very curious to have your thoughts about that. and how it can be a strategic objective rather than something you do on the margin when you have some time and when you meet some people. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to take 2 more and then you can answer all of them at once. We'll come over. So this over here. I'm writing them down.
Oh, sorry.
I'm writing them down.
Hi, I'm Zoe Kiris-Cullen from Fauna and Flora International. I've been really enjoying this panel. I wanted to pick up on Mark's point about influence and how the values of Plan Vivo can get extended more broadly in the market. And part of the scaling of Plan Vivo's impact is not only on the scaling of the direct use of the standards, but also sort of influencing what's perceived as the right way of doing things generally. And how we tackle the threatening energy which Pauline described, which I think really captures how I sort of feel day to day at the moment. One of the things that's really struck me is being looped into some of the multi-stakeholder initiative looking at how to scale the demand side of the market, and the corporate involvement, the solution providers involved, etc. How to support the demand side in understanding what high integrity looks like, what the procurement officers are looking for. But I was really struck recently by diagrams I've seen around describing the value chain and what this looks like and who the key components are. And generally you'll see a project developer, you'll see a broker, you'll see an end user that retires the credits, and maybe some service providers in the mix. But you won't actually see the people who are making the impact on the ground. The communities are utterly absent from those diagrams. It's like having a coffee value chain without the growers of the coffee. So I guess my question is, taking a long time about it, how do we get these messages into some of those areas? Not just the governments, but also the bigger private sector actors, the solution providers that are coming up with ideas. And I think the jurisdictional movement's very interesting, important. It's natural in terms of how we think about accounting evolving, but it is not focusing on the elements of care and integrity that really matter. You know, the carbon accountings might be, but anyway, sorry, too much.
All right, we'll start with those 2 and then we're going to come back to the final question. So the first 2, sort of, how do we be strategic and we think about scaling across rather than scaling up, or up and across in all directions? And whilst doing that, how do we make sure that we're influencing and thinking about not just buying more, but we're really influencing those that need to be influenced in the right way of doing things, getting people in the room, getting the right people in the room and getting the right people to be involved in those conversations. Who wants to go first?
Can I maybe just answer Zoe's question first, because it's a very good one, and actually coffee's a really good analogy, because a farmer will often get, you know, $1.50 for his kilo of coffee, and the coffee is sold in Starbucks for a kilo, which is, you know, $22, and that's what we're concerned about. But we can take control of that situation as sellers, as project developers, and we do. And we make that very clear. It's in our contractual agreements, it's in our VRPs. So any extra sell, any upside has to be paid back at the same 60% to the projects, to the project, to the communities, in whatever sort of scale that is. So you can do that as a project developer contractually. Not a problem. Now, I think your question, just to jump across, sorry, is there do you want to answer Zoe as well? Have you got anything?
If you can answer both, and then everybody gets a chance to answer all of both of them as well.
Let's do it that way, yeah. So I think your question was, how do we take our experience and spread it across the general landscape of... yes, we are. So we are doing that, absolutely. And, you know, this comes back to something that I brought up earlier today, and I keep on repeating, and within the Tanzanian carbon trading regulations, it stipulates 50% of revenue gross has to go to the communities. So we can put this into a regulatory framework at a national level as well. So that's an important thing to consider, that some of these challenges, and they are challenges, and the people who draw these diagrams, they're just consultants and they don't know what they're talking about, and it's fine, and I'm very happy to stand in the room and tell them that they don't know what they're talking about. I quite enjoy it. But But this is part of what, again, as the project developers, as we scale and we grow, we have to start taking responsibility to engage with some of these things which are flatly wrong. The science shows they're not, so it's important.
I'm going to stop you there and pass it along. I'd like to go to Molly, because I think this is so true that we sort of getting voices into the room. I mean, you're sitting there, you're convincing your CEO, you're convincing your peers, your customers. It is a different world. A lot of people that are involved in making decisions, policy decisions, attending some of these high-level meetings, and they are getting quite influential, might not have even left the UK, let alone Europe. And this all sounds lovely, but you have no idea, really, no experience of that. I mean, how do you handle that within your environment, or have you seen it in your environment? How do you get voices heard, I guess?
Yeah, there's a few. So something I have to be quite conscious of is different internal stakeholders wanting different things, right? And that's why having quite a comprehensive package from community helps us to get those decisions made. So I know that there's certain people I need to convince within the organisation who want to hear a personal story, and the fact that we can get video footage of people on the ground planting trees, talking about the benefits to their families, that's going to convince certain people. Other people want a giant pile of data, frankly, and I have to actually think about numbers, which I don't really like. But yeah, what I would say is that for us as buyers, well, for me, going to our procurement team and going to our CFO and saying, look, we want more money for these projects, the best thing that we can have is sort of help with the communications, essentially. So when you have these amazing stories from people on the ground, please share them with us. We want to sort of include them more in social media. We want to put them in our sustainable business report, and we hope that that's something that we can do to help kind of change that landscape. We know that other businesses will be looking at our sustainable business report, and if we can have a lovely picture of someone at a Plan Vivo project putting a tree in the ground, that's, I think, a lot nicer than a picture of a monocultural, you know, whatever.
And I've just caught Ina's eye, and I'd like to bring you in anyway, Ina, as UK government, but as government policies, procedures, not just UK, but just in general, and into this multilateral space. How do we bring these two worlds together in a way that, you know, when we're talking about Article 6, we're talking about the UN processes, that they really mean things, and actually what we heard this morning were more governments are going, oh, hang on, this carbon stuff, this is a commodity, I can grab this, I can tick a box over here. I want it for me, I don't really want to sell it through these guys anymore or out into this room. What's your sort of thoughts on some of that space?
Yes, thank you. And actually I was going to make a request as well, since we are doing the Christmas wish list here. Information, you know, you cannot underestimate how little people know about this out there. And as donors, yes, you talk to governments, you talk to other people, and it's really, usually what's out there is just the general concepts, and from there, the gossip of what things work and what don't, and once people make their minds, whatever the information, it could be very wrong, they've made up their minds, and it's very difficult. So if you can make this information that is easy to communicate, but also like valid, so you can have a technical conversation with somebody and can explain what was that you were mentioning earlier, pollination something. This is a new term for me, so but it is, how do you communicate as donors? How do you go and sit with the ministers of finance that are now mega excited about this because they think that this is where all the money is going to be? And well, there will be some, but it's also, there's many pitfalls, and scale with care, of course, it's a good line. But that information needs to come from people from the ground who have been doing this for a long time, but make it very simple. Think of your audiences, and think that the donors is one of your key audience, that will be your helpers really along the way, that may be the way to get into, through governments on large scale. Think of other levels of government, as Peter was saying. So that will be a completely different audience. What about cities and the peri-urban spaces? Is this an area where you're going to be working? Maybe, maybe not. But just think of these different ways in which you can communicate, and make it available. When linking with other standards as well. So there will be moments when we're going to be faced constantly about is this a scam, is this greenwashing, and as the amount of money gets bigger, we're going to be more exposed to that. And we know, as in Plan Vivo, we've seen projects that have failed and constantly come back to bite. And the best way to make a response externally is actually not to do it just from Plan Vivo, but do it across the carbon offset and carbon credit community with Gold Standard, with the Vera, with all these other standards. So also think about how do you influence across, working not just as competitors, but working together. So, yeah, well, I can continue, but I will leave it in there.
Thank you.
Just really quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry, you really weren't wrong with your comment about how little people know about, like, I explain offsets on an almost daily basis, sometimes multiple times to the same person. And I think I just wanted to give a shout out to your Plan Vivo animation that we saw earlier. It's absolutely fantastic, and I'm in future just going to send people that link. I think that's it just showcases everything that you folks do. And
if you do know about carbon and offsets, it's not in a good way, and that's your starting base. Can I just say one question, then I want to come, there's a question here and then a question behind. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on what Ina said. I mean, I think what we found is, now that we have a bit more capacity to do what Ina's asking us to do and giving us good advice on as well, to get out and speak to different people to get the message out a bit more. Actually, people really get it. Even Luke are just back from project visits in Latin America. They met with the Congress of the Honduran government. They explained what Plan Vivo is. They're like, oh, that's not what we know as a carbon standard at all. This is all about communities. And so people get it, actually, but I think maybe we just need to really make the effort to get out and get the message out better, and to try and influence it. And it comes back to Celine's question about that influencing across. We have the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which is positioning itself as the new authority over what's good for standards, what's the level for standards. And we've got a chance to influence that through partnerships, which you mentioned, Mark. And we were at a consultation, Zoe was on it, and others started talking about benefit sharing. And it got a conversation going, and some people in that weren't very comfortable to talk about it, but we got enough of energy around it that's now been put into the ICVCM requirements. Now, it's one small thing and a big thing, but we can influence. But Plan Vivo on its own isn't going to do that. We need the partnerships, we need people saying the same message, we need buyers talking about why these are important, asking other carbon standards, why don't you have transparent benefit sharing in your standard, things like this. So I do think that kind of influencing across and not being afraid to go and engage with people who we think maybe, oh, this is such a big thing, they won't really take us seriously. We've got a lot of power, a lot of knowledge, experience and passion in this room and in this network that we should talk more about. Perfect.
We're going to take the final 3 questions. We'll keep them short, and then you can answer. You can take it in turns to answer all 3 if you want to. We'll go here.
Mark Huxton from ACES. I'm interested in what the panel thinks of climate justice and whether they use that phrase. The reason I'm asking the question is partly inspired by Mark's comments around influencing the framework. I increasingly speak to people here in the UK who say things like, well, that sounds nice to invest in mangroves, but we're only investing in trees here in Scotland. And sometimes they're explicit about their reasons. Sometimes it's carbon colonialism or something like that. Quite often they're not explicit, and I'm a bit suspicious about their thinking, possibly about, oh, we can't trust these people in distant countries to do their job. I think there's an important response to that, which is around climate justice and investing in communities that are exposed to the threats and have done nothing to cause the problem. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Great. We'll go to the second. We'll go to this table.
Thanks, Emily. No, I don't really have a question. I just wanted to quickly add in a small comment. So uncomfortable as it is when we think about scaling, we're, for Plan Vivo and some of the people who have developed projects, obviously for Plan Vivo, the commercial reality of the world speaks very strongly to what people on the panel have been saying about the scale part of it. We can't go to scale without taking care of the communication side. And just, I wanted to put a thought in everyone's head. And I don't want to make this a sort of us and them type of scenario, but the oil majors spent about the same on political lobbying, media, and marketing of their green credentials in the last 2 years as they did on renewable investments. So if any company, organization here who is running a project and thinking of scaling wants to do that successfully, they should be thinking about allocating a similar amount of their budget to communications and projecting the confidence that we've heard about on the panel here to the world, both about the standard itself and about the work of each project. It's at least 3% of your operation budget. And if you're not spending that, you're never going to go to scale successfully, I would say.
Great point. And I know something that everybody is challenging. I'm going to go for Richard, and we'll take 2 quick ones, and then we've got to sort of wrap up and listen to a video. Richard?
Yeah, well, I'd first just like to say that this has been an amazing event, and I'm so grateful and impressed by the team that have been assembled, here, and the way that Plan Vivo is taking itself forward. I would just say something to pick on that word confidence. I would say the important thing is to really project confidence and not really say, can we scale with care? We are going to scale with care. We are going to take it to the next level. We are going to do this now. We've laid the ground, solid foundations. So I think just comparing Plan Vivo with some of the other sort of schemes out there, one of the things, it is so much better. It's pretty obvious. But the key thing is to project that in a very confident way, because and quite a simple way in a way, because as has been said, people, I think there's a culture, perhaps because we're in Scotland and Britain, we kind of like to explain it in detail. We like to appear consultative, that lots of people will have opinions and maybe slightly even apologetic at times. We should be just changing that voice a bit more to get to the next level. Big business doesn't talk in a kind of apologetic way ever, even if they have a lot of things to apologize about. So just, I know it's difficult and possibly even against our sort of inner natures to sometimes, but I'm impressed with the way it's going, and I'm sure it will definitely get that way. Thanks.
I think knowing that there's information and facts and projects and knowledge behind you enables you to kind of go out and speak confidently. Final question.
Yeah, thanks. Robbie from Knockout. Just wanted to pick up on a couple of comments that were already made, including something you said there, Keith, about having the capacity to do things, and also maybe speaks to confidence as well, because it's one thing to know that you need a communication person. It's another thing to know that you need a lawyer. I know Mark's been talking about some of the the great capacity that you've got now, but so I think we also need to focus on building our own organisations and institutions, and so. Maybe scaling enables further scaling. So how do we get to the next step where we've got the capacity to have a communication person and to be more strategic? So maybe we need to think about when we're going to donors or we're investors to think about that as well. We need not just investment in getting that next project to the market, but we need investment into our capabilities to do all these other things, and then we'll be so much more effective at those other things.
Fantastic, thank you, Robbie. And we're going to end with Keith, so I know you'll want to respond to that one. And I think that's it, isn't it? It's very chicken and egg. What comes first, growing the organisation or growing the actual carbon credits we want to sell? And how do you grow them so you've got something to sell, but you need to be able to manage that and handle the information that comes with it. So we're going to come back down the sort of retail side. Molly, we're going to start there. There were sort of two questions. That sort of feeling about climate justice, and how do we handle that? Do I do something at home? And there's sometimes a desire to do something at home because you feel everything is so out of your control that maybe doing something at home is right, but equally there is this fundamental underlying question about justice. And I think the other bit is about the sort of confidence balancing, having those conversations when perhaps you don't have all the numbers at your fingertips, but you still need to come across as knowing they're there. So can you build and speak with confidence?
Yeah, so I'm really glad that I get to answer the climate justice question. I think that it's such an important point. And from my personal perspective, I think that doing projects in some of the regions that we've talked about today is like an absolutely fundamental way we can start to redress some of the problems that we've caused. So I'm on completely with you on that one, so are most people in my company, but we just need to do a really good job of communicating that these projects are not us going there and telling people what to do. It's providing a framework and a way that people can further monetize protecting their own land, leading from the communities, as you're saying. On the confidence piece, I don't know if I'm going to exactly answer the question, but it's a really tough time to be a company talking about sustainability authentically and in a way that reflects the science and reflects what's going on in the world. And I think something that we've had to learn at Springer Nature is that actually it's okay to sit up and say, look, we don't have all the answers. We're doing our best at the moment with the information that's available. I think where some companies fall a bit flat is by presenting their climate solutions as kind of, great, we fixed it, done. Actually, in our future sustainability reports, we're going to try and be a little bit more open and say, you know, we don't have all the answers. We have the start of a roadmap, and we've got some great partners sort of with us on the journey.
Fantastic. Khalil.
All of them?
Climate justice and then a sort of, you know, talking with confidence, which you're doing quite a good job of, actually. So
Yeah,
I think you're all right.
I'd like to pick up actually what Molly was saying. Confidence is a wonderful thing when it's rightfully placed. Equally, I find that when we try and project confidence when we clearly don't know what we're talking about, I feel like we're also doing ourselves a disservice. Personally, I do not want to speak confidently about the things that I know nothing about. I do think we do have a role to be more vocal about the things we are confident about, something that has not sort of been implied but hasn't been necessarily emphasized in all of this is if we don't play that confidence with what we've learned, then the industry is going to keep doing the dumb things that the industry has continued to do. I don't think it's rocket science to anyone to acknowledge that like custodians of the land who are local or just understand their landscape better, and so if we're trying to ultimately change land use, then the people who manage the land have an important voice at the table, and that needs to be projected. And we're not going to individually ourselves here do it all, but what we can do is create that influence, think about horizontal, creating the model that allows that to scale. And I think that's our responsibility to be confident in those areas.
Tim?
Yeah, so COTAP's tagline is not on the website yet, but it's on all the merch. It's Global Climate Justice, and it's pretty broad, you know, and it means different things to different people. Like in the U.S., you know, folks throw that term around in terms of in conversations when talking about, you know, polluting power plants or near disadvantaged communities. Most folks throw it around in the adaptation sense of, you know, I don't even need to explain it here, but like, you know, rural communities are most likely to feel the worst impacts of climate change first and all that. COTAP's take on that is, you know, it's that, and, you know, I wouldn't want to say that, you know, those are wrong. It's just like, we use it too, and that's equally valid, and this is what it means to us. Is that, you know, the rural vulnerable communities being the first and most likely to feel the impacts. But it's also like on the market side, you know, if you're talking about a land-based, nature-based carbon offset project or carbon credit, or whatever you want to call it, with finite boundaries and a finite capacity to produce a certain amount of dollars per year, or tons and dollars per year, then, you know, to me, it follows that any you know, dollar not received by the communities, because that's like a snapshot in time of an opportunity that's properly addressed. Any dollar per ton not received for a nature-based project is a permanent missed opportunity for poverty alleviation. And that's like a guiding principle. And it's why I'm still trying to figure out the scale piece, still trying to keep the price high, and it's it's about the financial inclusion, like those folks who are not born into a more advantaged economic situation. It's a great opportunity to create supplemental income, and it's just been overlooked and passed over. And the names of, if you don't have like the revenue share embedded, then it gets, folks lose sight of it. And in terms of like, was a horizontal scale in confidence. More recently, as you kind of know what you're doing, you know what you're good at, you know what hasn't worked through trial and error, you get more confident, and is helpful, and to do things like if folks come, because it seems like hopefully I've protected projects come to COTAP before potential buyers come to COTAP equally as much, if not more, or whatever, than the projects, and I can kind of sort through some of these opportunities to protect projects from them. But there's a lot of people that's come out of the woodwork. Talk is cheap, basically, and you go look them up, and their website's been up for 3 months. There's a way to check that, and you look at their LinkedIn profile, and they've been doing it for a month, and you're like, especially the crypto people.
On that note,
they'll say, well, you'll be on vacation. They'll be like, I got 4,000 tons burning a hole in my pocket. 2 months later, half of that. So it does happen, and that's what's difficult about the confidence. It's like you're not sure what you're dealing with, but I mean, once you start talking about money and timelines, then that's how you find out. And I've had situations where folks, just being more collaborative, scaling. What was it, horizontally? Just being more collaborative with other resellers, you would think, or competitors.
I think that's great.
We compare notes, and if COTAP hasn't raised enough money to buy the amount of credits that have been set aside, then I've let other, and this is has not necessarily always worked, but I'll try to let them know, and then you don't really know whether or not to what degree the project's trying to hit a weighted average target, price, so.
There's
stuff
definitely
like
that balancing act, isn't there, between being sort of, how do I communicate, be confident, but be backed up with fact.
Yeah.
But not too confident, if we're not confident enough about stuff. So we need to make sure we feel secure in it, and knowing that there are a lot of organisations out there that perhaps have slightly less scruples in what they're talking about. So we've got to find ways to overcome that. So to Mark and to Keith, sort of the three bits, that sort of climate justice, how important is that, and how do you handle that? The confidence, I think we're fine on confidence, but any thoughts you have, but I think it's that capacity growth, communicating whilst growing, which comes first?
They all come together. I think we are moving into a new space now, for those of us who have been working in this space for 10 years. We're moving into a space where we are talking about changing the global narrative on how we value nature. That answers the question related to the whoever the person was, hope it wasn't your friend, who said that they thought this was like a colonial land grab. Well, in the red space, all we're saying is, you guys have been living like this for thousands of years. We'd really like to carry on. And by the way, we're going to connect you to the global financial system. It's really not that complicated. Communication, as Joe pointed out, is absolutely critical, because this is a complex process. This is a complex space. And we need to try and communicate that to people who can only think in very, can I call it, simplistic terms? And that's fine, because the world is a complex place. But I think the confidence, grow, communicate, collaborate, tell these stories, support the standards, carry on moving forward is absolutely critical for this to go where we want it to go in the next 20 to 30 years.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to focus my answer on Robbie's question on the capacity, because I think everyone's answered everything else pretty well. And it wasn't a plant, but it's a very good question because it leads very nicely into what happens after this. But for us, I think the first thing was to grow our own capacity as Plan Vivo. As Richard's comment was, we came from a very solid base, but we had to grow our own organisation to be able to communicate about what we do, to have people like Diana who helped create this amazing animation. That's the first step, is having the capacity to do it ourselves. Step 2 is now how do we grow that capacity in our network? Part of that is shared learning from projects that have already done a lot of this. We don't need to reinvent the wheel again. The second bit of that is also how do we help projects have more support structures in the areas they work. So strengthening the regional capacity. Eva and the panel on regional perspectives, you heard of that, the importance of having that regional presence, people on the ground to support project development, linking with service providers on the ground, so that's one. And I think the second one is stepping outside of our role as purely being a standard to actually being more of a foundation where we really help to grow the capacity of the whole network, particularly early projects that need that development to grow the capacity to then access these markets and become sustainable on their own. So that's what we're trying to do. A great example, and thanks Robbie for teeing it up, is what we're trying to do in the space of blue carbon. And we have Mark here asked that question on climate justice, who's the architect of the first blue carbon project ever. We certified it, we're very proud of that. Monarusi, who sadly couldn't be here, you'll see a video, has built on that, is scaling up that model that started from one project on the coast of Kenya, Makoko Pamoja, and has now been replicated and scaled up. And we want to use the network here to bring all the different elements together. New projects, potential funders, service providers, innovators. Mark Beeston's on the front row here as well. We're doing a lot of great work in this space to bring the people together to make it happen. And I think that's the next step. So it's building that capacity, not just within Plan Vivo, but within the whole network.
Brilliant, thank you, Keith. And I think we're now going to have the video from Monarusi. I think we've heard a lot about the sort of balancing growth with quality, keeping the Plan Vivo core at our heart, communicating with confidence is a great way forward. And I think that is at so many different levels. It's on the ground with the people doing the hard graft, and it's right through to sort of governments, multilaterals, buyers, everybody within this, and sort of making sure the right information is there to back up those conversations and support each other. This sort of networking, this horizontal discussions and growth is just at the heart of it. So I think we're going to be launching our Blue Carbon Hub and introducing it, but before we do so, we've got Monarusi on the video, I think, to talk about her Blue Carbon project. As Keith said, is the first one that Plan Vivo is certified, and I think it's a hugely exciting and important space. And I think on the world of communication, I think this is not well known outside of this space, and moving that conversation to this broader area of carbon is going to be really exciting in the years to come. So I'll say thank you to my panelists first, because and then we can play the video and introduce Blue Carbon. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Hello everyone, I'm Monarusi Mwafrika Salim, and I work with Vanga Blue Forest Project, which is a mangrove conservation and restoration project here in Kenya. I'm so delighted to join other stakeholders together with Plan Vivo in celebrating 25 years of service. So it's too sad that I didn't make it to the meeting, but I'm very happy to be part of the discussions on scaling with care. Let me give a brief history of Vanga Blue Forest. Vanga Blue Forest started through Makoko Pamoja, that is in 2014, and the project Makoko Pamoja conserves around 117 hectares of mangroves, through which it reduces emissions of over 1,500 metric tons and also supports 2 communities that is within the locality. Okay, so the project did upscale to Vanga Blue Forest, which is in a neighboring community from Gazi, and Vanga Blue Forest now started in 2020. And it supports a number of 3 communities, which is almost a population of 9,000 people. And it reduces emissions of over 5,000 metric tons, that is annually. And the area that is designated for the carbon project is of 460 hectares. For the history that I've given, our project has shown growth over time, which is quite a critical agent in each and every entity that is operating in this world. Okay, and I will say that the greatest tool that has driven the growth over time is community engagement, that is through enhancement of the participatory approach in each and every stage of the project. And just to contribute on these discussions on how we can scale up, how small-scale projects such as Vanga Blue Forest or Mikoko Pamoja, how can they cope with the scaling up of Plan Vivo Foundation? So our project, a good example is we are looking towards providing quality carbon within the market. So we as Vanga Blue Forest, we are looking to speed up and also catch up with Plan Vivo by providing quality carbon to the market. And by this, I mean that we do target in the coming years, we bundle up seagrass conservation into the already ongoing mangrove carbon project, which yields over 5,000 metric tons of carbon per year. This means that we will be supporting more communities. We will be enhancing the conservation of more marine habitats. We will be engaging more community, and also this reads that the community will be reaping more benefits from the project. So before I throw the ball back to the floor, I'm happy that Plan Vivo is celebrating 25 years of service. And what I'm looking towards the forthcoming years on their progress is development of the biodiversity standard or the biodiversity plus. Because with this document or with this tool, I'm so sure projects such as ours are going to benefit more, because we have a vast of resources which are not accounted for within the project. When we look at the biodiversity of the crabs and all that, the fishery aspect, all that is quite not well accounted for within the project. And I believe by the development of this critical tool within Plan Vivo, it's going to be a plus for us. Okay, I would like to end this there. So for these few remarks, I'd like to thank Plan Vivo Foundation for giving me this platform to voice out the ideas of both Vanga Blue Forest project and also Mikoko Pamoja project. Thank you for watching this. In case of any remarks or you would wish to reach out to me or to our project, don't hesitate to contact Plan Vivo in order to get our contact. Thank you. Stay blessed.